Thanks for joining us this morning as we continue to answer your questions on what's after life. If you're out there and you would like somebody to pray for you, you can still connect with those people online. They're happy to pray for you. Also, please send in your questions. Those questions we can attempt to answer this week, or we will answer next week as our pastor continues this series on what's after life. The question that comes to the forefront, and one which Pastor so beautifully answered this morning, is the most asked question we've had, and that is this: will we know family and friends when we're in heaven? Well, the straight up answer is absolutely we will. Yes, we will. God does not wipe away our memories. God wipes away our tears. The verse of Scripture that the pastor referred to this morning out of Luke chapter 16 and in verse 9. It's one that talks about how we use our worldly resources to benefit others. And it says, for those who do that, there will be friends waiting for them in heaven. 2 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 12, our pastor referred to this beautiful story in the Old Testament concerning King David. When David and his infant son was in a condition of the son dying, and David was there grieving over his son as he was dying. And David said this statement after the death of this infant child. He said, I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. Another verse of Scripture, which is also very helpful to us in knowing about the future and about those friends or family who will meet us there in heaven, we can find in also the book of Luke, chapter 22, verses 17 and 18. Jesus promises his disciples that they will once again in heaven experience the Lord's Supper together. So there are some things that identify very clearly, and we see many of the near-death experiences tell us about meeting friends and family in heaven. So those can be addressed further as well. Another question that pops up is, will we be married in heaven? That's a good question. The answer to that is also pretty straightforward because Jesus himself answers this question, and that is, no, we will not be married in heaven. Luke chapter 20, verse 34 through 35 says this. This is Jesus' own words. The sons of this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are counted worthy, we'll pause there for a second, for those who are counted worthy, that is, they're worthy simply because of what Christ did for them on the cross. They're becoming Christ followers because they have followed in belief what Jesus did for them on the cross. So those who are counted worthy to attain that age, the age of being in heaven, and the resurrection from the dead, neither marry nor are they given in marriage. It is a good question because it has a lot of emotional implication which ties to it. Marriage, the Scripture says, is a reflection of the relationship between Christ and his church. In fact, as many young ladies through the years of my ministry have asked me to pray for them concerning them finding a life mate, I always pray like this. I say, Lord, would you give this one a young man who will love her as Christ has loved the church? Well, that's our example. Christ and the church and his love for the church, and that is explained in almost all marriage ceremonies with Christians that I've been a part of through the years. Marriage is a reflection of that relationship of both Jesus and his relationship to the church. So it's a reflection, and there's some implications with that. Number one is we marry to reflect that relationship of Christ and the church. Number two is we marry to avoid sexual sin. Number three, we marry to procreate or to produce the next generation. So we'll no longer be needing to do that. That'll no longer be part of what heaven is about. The Scripture says, for now we see through a mirror dimly or darkly in 1 Corinthians. And why settle for a reflection darkly when we will be able to see clearly in those days? This question came in last week, and we didn't have time to answer it then. Let me attempt to do that now. The question was, what is the death stare? Well, that's a good question. And in terms of doctors, it's called the fixed stare. The fixed stare. Number one, let me say that first, even if a person can't respond to you, don't assume the person can't hear you. Near death, I have talked to many people who were not able to respond, but I knew they were hearing me. Don't assume that, because hearing is the last sense to go as we are passing from this life into the next. We know that through the Royal College of Nursing. We know that through the experiences of scientists as well. So they do hear us. But the death or fixed stare simply means this: death is soon approaching. So when you have that experience of somebody who is just staring into the distance, it's because death is surely approaching and will be approaching very quickly. Well, are they getting a glimpse of something like heaven or like angels? Well, the answer to that is perhaps. Perhaps they are. I have been with many hospice patients who are transitioning from this life to the next life, and many times they will say, "I'm seeing the angels." Or I'm seeing this. I'm seeing a light at the end. The Scripture does not address this in any detail. And we never rely on experience, but we can rely on what the Scripture tells us about these things. So what is the fixed stare? It simply means that death is soon approaching. And are they seeing into heaven or seeing something, getting a glimpse of those things? Absolutely, that is a possibility. I say it just having been there with so many friends and people and even family at that time. So here's another question. Why have so many Christians experienced this near-death experience? I think Pastor dealt with that toward the end of his message today in a very wonderful way. Perhaps it is to give us hope. For us who are believers, who are Christ followers, perhaps it is to give us hope or encouragement for the future. The near-death experience Christians always identify these emotions when they return from that experience. One is they were totally free from fear. Imagine that, to be moving or transitioning from this life to the next, and then the absence of any kind of fear. It's not to be fretted over or fearful. Number two is they're free from pain. If they've been in a hospital, they've been in a surgical situation, or perhaps they've been in an accident. It says they are free from pain. They're not feeling the pain that they had been feeling as well. Another overwhelming, from 70-something% of the people that have responded after near-death experiences, they still say this: we feel loved and we feel accepted, and that sense of being loved and accepted is an overwhelming sense that we experience. There's also this statement which has accompanied all of those who have returned from a near-death experience, and that is an overwhelming sense of peace. It's a peaceful experience and not something that is to be feared or to be afraid of. I remember the story of Dwight Moody when he was dying, and Dr. R.G. Lee when he was dying, and one woke during the time of being resuscitated, and he said, "I've just got a glimpse of heaven, and don't wake me again." And I that is a pretty cool way to look at that. So why have they had an overwhelming sense as a Christians in this? It's because to know Christ is to know the Prince of Peace. According to a 1982 Gallup poll, it records in the New York Times that over 8 million people have had a near-death experience. Now that was, that's almost 40 years ago, 38 years ago, that number of people. Imagine what that is today. Our pastor's outline on the scripture references today, he dealt with that out of Thessalonians 4:13 through 18. And part of that verse of scripture says this: "And those who have fallen asleep," and let me clarify what that means. For those who have fallen asleep, when Christ comes and returns to bring up those who have fallen asleep, he is bringing up the bodies which have already been separated from the soul. The scripture says the soul has gone on to be in heaven. The scripture says, as Jesus told the thief on the cross, this day you will be with me in paradise. And the scripture also says to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. So Jesus answers some of those questions as well. For those who have fallen asleep, meaning for those whose dead bodies will be resurrected at the end time as Jesus comes to return, as the pastor had said, with the trumpet, the sound of the trumpet. In verse 15, we who are alive and remain, that means simply those who are here on earth, who are still alive, will also meet with Christ. I won't attempt to rehash all that the pastor said. He did such a wonderful job with that and explaining this passage of Scripture. Another thing that we'll see here, and the question that seems to come every time we deal with a topic like this: will there be a welcoming party in heaven after we die? Will there be a welcoming party in heaven waiting on us after we die? The straight up question is, yes, there will be. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 22 and verse 23 talks about the city of the living God. That city of the living God, of course, representing heaven, as Jesus has gone to prepare a place for us. This city of the living God is heaven. And the scripture tells us that these three will be waiting on us, these three entities. Number one, it says there will be angels waiting on us. And the verse of Scripture says there will be thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly. So the angels will be waiting on us. And it says thousands upon thousands. It's like the verse of Scripture we find in Luke where the angels were in heaven and they came to see the birth of Christ and they stood over the shepherds. There were myriads of angels at that point. The Scripture also says that there will be people. The church of the firstborn, believers, will be there waiting upon us. And then it finally says, God, you have come to God, the judge of all men, who will be waiting for us. And so this leads us to that next question. Can people see us from heaven? Luke 15:7 says, I say unto you likewise, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents. Also in verse 10 of chapter 15, there is joy in the presence of God over one sinner who repents. So from heaven, there is observation of what's going on here. And when people turn to Christ and become Christ followers, there's joy that accompanies that as these observers are observing what's taking place. We've already seen in Hebrews chapter 11 this hall of fame of the Old Testament saints, for those who have died, those who have served God, and then those who ultimately have served Christ, who have perished and gone on to heaven. This group of people will be cheering us on, is what Scripture says in Hebrews chapter 12 and in verse 1. My 30 seconds left, I'm going to say this final part here. And this question is always asked: will there be pets in heaven? We don't know. However, Isaiah 11 verses 16 and 7, and I believe, yes, there will be. It says this: the wolf shall lie down with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze, and their young ones shall lie down together. Romans 8, verses 18 through 27 tells us that Christ came to redeem all creation, not just human beings, but all creations. And some have addressed this through the years, those great theologians, as the peaceable kingdom. Well, I want to thank you for joining us. And like I said earlier, if you have questions, send those questions in. We will be very pleased to attempt to answer those. And we have been happy today to share with you and to rehash a little bit of what our pastor has shared in his message, as well as answering some questions that have come in through the days that have been behind us. So as those come in this week, we will answer those once again at this time following next week's sermon. And we are so pleased that you have joined us today. Thank you for being here.